But there were three big changes in the material culture of late Second Temple period Judaism that occurred in the 1st century BC. Number one, they began to practice daily immersion in water. It's called a mikvah, a baptismal tank. So if you've been to Israel, you've seen mikvah, or these baptismal tanks. Normally there are 7 steps. It's self-immersion. You take off all your clothes, you go down into the water, you come back out, and now you are ritually pure for another day. The second thing that they changed was the way that they buried their dead. When someone died, they began a process of secondary burial. So now a 1st century tomb looks just like my hand. There's an antechamber here, and there are niches called kokim. And after the body decomposes, 1 year it would take, then those bones are collected into a bone box, an ossuary, and then pushed into these niches. You could have 50, 60, 70 family members all buried in the same tomb. So when we read that Jesus was buried in a tomb where a man had never been laid, well, of course, for us as Westerners, we might say, why would you ever put someone in someone else's tomb? Well, it's because this is the way that a 1st century family tomb functioned. The third big change has to do with stone vessels, and that's what you're looking at here. This is not pottery, this is limestone. It comes from a cup that we would call a mug or a measuring cup, some call it, but typical form from the 1st century that would have been used especially at ritual occasions like Passover because it is not susceptible to ritual impurity. Now I'm going to give you a verse that you may have never heard a sermon on before. All right. Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 15. When your pottery becomes impure, says the Lord, you must break it. When's the last time you heard a good sermon on that? As if we don't have enough broken pottery in Israel already. Now we've got Yahweh commanding us to break our pottery. How does it become ritually impure? When you become ritually impure, you transfer that impurity. Now, I heard your pastor's sermon this morning. He did a really good job of talking about this woman with the issue of impurity. Anything she touched, it would transfer the impurity to that, and now it would have to be broken by Levitical law. But it says nothing about your stone vessels. So they found a way to beat the system, okay? Because stone vessels, they believed, were not susceptible to ritual impurity. What was the first miracle of Jesus? What did he do? Turn the water into pomegranate wine. Good. He turns the water into See, from now on, it's going to all be about the pomegranate. We'll all be in communion from now on. You'll be taking pomegranate juice. No, he turns the water into wine. And if you look at John 2, it will tell you something about the jars. The jars were stone. Not clay, not ceramic, not like the big one you're going to see when you go to our exhibit at University of Northwestern. These were stone jars. That's that ritual purity culture. So when we find things like this, it's very interesting because we move deeper into the archaeological record. They will begin to disappear and new things will begin to appear that are indicative of that earlier time period. How do we date a site? Well, we use ceramics because pottery changes over time. We can use carbon dates up to a certain period. They're very accurate. We have glyptic materials sometimes, like scarabs and other things that help us date as well. So I'm normally looking for 3 metrics to nail down a date. I'd like to get a good, clean ceramic date, maybe a numismatic date using coins in that stratum to help me, and then a carbon date. And if I can take those 3 things and triangulate, and they all give me the same date, then I can have a high degree of confidence in that date. Well, speaking of which, we see an interesting object from this last summer. This is an inkwell. Anytime we get a whole vessel, we get excited. And we scraped the inside of this and we're having it tested so we know what the ink was actually composed of. I have found styluses also in regular 1st century houses. Styluses, inkwells. Why do we care? We care because of the issue of literacy. The issue of literacy begins way, way back in the time of Moses, when we would have people tell us Moses couldn't have possibly written the Pentateuch because he was illiterate. There was no alphabet with which to write it and so forth. Well, you'll see in the New Patterns of Evidence film that that's simply not true, but they carry that argument all the way through into New Testament times. People will tell you that Jesus was an illiterate Galilean peasant, which is fine if he was, but is that really what the text says? There's not a crime or a sin to be illiterate or to be a peasant. But the text just simply doesn't bear that out. We see in Luke chapter 4 that Jesus takes the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He publicly reads it, as was his custom. In other words, that's the claim of literacy. And then we know, of course, in John 7 of Jesus writing in the sand. So we've got reading and writing both going on. Does the material culture bear this out? And the answer is yes. We find writing material in everyday, common first century homes. Let me give you an example. Josephus tells us that there was a wall, a partition on the Temple Mount in the days of Jesus, and that partition had 24 signs on it, 12 in Latin and 12 in Greek, alternating. 2 of them have been found archaeologically. So Josephus had his facts right on this, and it separated the court of the Gentiles. Gentiles can't go past this point. What does the sign say? Any Gentile who crosses this line will be responsible for his own death. So you mean to tell me that we're putting people to death because they're illiterate? So people can't read, but we're going to put up signs that if you cross this point, you're going to be put to death. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. In Ephesians 2, you read about a wall of separation that God has destroyed. I think that's the wall that's pictured there. These levels of sanctity that Gentiles can only go this far, women can only go this far, non-priests can go this far, high priests can go this far. This segregated society that Jesus came to destroy those walls, I think is a powerful lesson. You can see here what we would call a Middle Bronze Age milk jug. I don't know why we call it a milk jug, we just do. Maybe it looks like what the milkman would leave outside your door. Of course, be goat's milk. But when we've seen enough of these, then we can diagnostically date, even though the rim is broken off, which is the most important part. We can be very confident of the date of a vessel like this. You can see a lamp from the time of King David. In fact, this is what we would call an Iron Age 2A lamp, which is exactly the time of David. Now, why would that excite me? Did David say anything about lamps? Lights, Psalm 119, 105. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. What was David picturing? I don't even think David knew what a lamp would have looked like from 200 years earlier, okay? And he certainly didn't know what they looked like in the future. When he's picturing what God's word is like, this is what he has in mind. In other words, it provides light. Now, in a house, that's not a problem. You set it on a ledge, you fill it with olive oil, you see where the wick goes at the end. You can still see the char or the burn there. But what about if you want to go outside because your word is a lamp to my path? How do you take that outside without the oil spilling, without the wick blowing out? I used to always wonder that until we discovered that they were using lanterns. So they had lanterns and with shelves in them, so you could have several lamps within a lantern. So this then becomes a metaphor for the scriptures. A lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Well, right next to that pomegranate that we talked about is this scarab. Now, let me tell you what a scarab is. The Latin word scarabus means beetle, and it's because the Egyptians believed that the dung beetle pushed the sun across the sky every day. Of course, they're polytheistic. They worship many things, but to me, this is kind of a silly thing. Of all things to worship would be a dung beetle, but this is what they believe. I mean, the ancient Greeks, at least, they believed that Apollo hooked up his 4 horsemen and pulled the sun across the sky every day. There's some nobility to that. But no, the humble dung beetle. So they're always in the shape of a beetle. We found 4 this last summer. So I decided to give them names. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The Beatles. And this is John. No, it's actually, he's got a much more august name. This is Thutmose III. He's the greatest of all the pharaohs, the most powerful. He conquered all of Canaan in about 1483, left his mark everywhere. He's the big guy in the 18th dynasty. Thutmose III, you can see his cartouche, the oval right in the middle. So this is just about the size of a quarter. The shape of a beetle. There's a hole that goes through the center, so it can be worn around the neck or even on a ring sometimes. But it's his impression. It's his royal seal. Now this matters because no previous pharaoh ever used that same iconography in that same order. No later pharaoh is ever going to use that same iconography in that same way. So this thing gives us absolute dating because assuming that we have good dates in Assyria and good dates in Egypt, then we can cleanly date the stratification that we're in. And once we can do that, then that which is below it is older, that which is above it is younger, and then we can work out a chronology. So this is clearly 18th dynasty. In my view, Thutmose III would be the pharaoh of the oppression. His successor, Amenhotep II, would be the pharaoh of the Exodus. Regardless of whether I'm correct about that, this is important because it's 18th dynasty. So when someone argues that the sites weren't occupied, nobody was at home at Jericho, for example, when Joshua and the Israelites were supposed to have arrived, so you can't trust the Bible. Did you know that they had the same scarab at Jericho? Did you know they have the same scarab at Mount Ebal? And the same scarab now at Shiloh. And in each of those three instances, guess what the glyptic scarab experts have to say about that? These are commemorative scarabs. Commemorative scarabs. Later peoples came along and they created these like trading cards, if you will. They're commemorative. Well, isn't that convenient? That when we get evidence that synchronizes with the biblical text, all of a sudden it's commemorative. And my response to that is, says who and based on what? So I'd like to know some evidence for that, not just because it's contradicting your anti-biblical paradigm.